see you all here today. I'm glad you all could make it. So, just in a way, a bit of announcements. One thing I will say, this is the last week we have in this room. From there on after, except like 1 week in October, which I'll let you know, we will be in our normal room finally, SSA 12.471. It'll be in the Discord announcement when it comes, but just know that we will not be in this room next week or really any other week. So this is just a special thing. Also, pancakes. I was going to mention, we have in addition to these weekly meetings, for anyone new, we have monthly meetings known as Pancakes and Mortification. And those are really places that we go out to Denny's and we basically just talk about really any theological topic just under the sun. Like, it's a place to ask hard questions, it's a place to ask curious questions, just anything at all. We talk, we hash it out, we really just have a good time. And so usually we do these on the first Saturday of the month. However, this Saturday is Labor Day weekend, and so a lot of people are probably going to be traveling. So we're delaying that till the next Saturday. So I believe it's September the 9th. Whatever Saturday is after that, I believe it's September 9th. We'll be having Pancakes Pontification at the Denny's on Preston Road and Plano Parkway.
They'll post the address.
Again, yeah, more specific details will come. The address will be posted. So yeah, and so tonight we'll be talking about the evidence for Christianity from non-Christian, kind of stuff outside the Bible. So it's going to be really, really interesting. And I will also mention, just as a general kind of thing, when we go back to our normal room in the SSA, we will actually be able to have snacks once again. Yeah, but we are kind of suffering the loss of our last snack coordinator, given that she's graduated. So if that's your thing, food, cooking, anything like that, if you're interested, just meet with me or someone else, and
I'll give you a gift card to pay for.
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Just, somebody that can pick it up and bring it.
Yeah, all we need is just like someone to
baking is also especially appreciated.
Bring in, and yeah, if you're good at cooking, if you'd like to.
No pressure, no.
But no pressure. Just
It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be
right up
anything
your alley.
fancy.
Then great. If not, that's all right. So I will leave it to Alan to discuss this.
I like how the duck squeaked as part of the intro.
It's ambiance.
All right. Let's see. We could mention there is one other time we're not in our normal room. We have the poster now. Thanks to Sarah. We have a very special guest speaker, Dr. Bill Dembski. He's sort of a pioneer in the intelligent design movement, and we're very fortunate to have him speak in person. So we have the SSA auditorium. So we have a ton of room. So invite some friends, spread the word. I know Kenneth has been talking to a lot of the other Christian groups. They're going to promote it and Focus BSM and some other ones. But it's a great one to bring non-believers to, because it's just going to be sort of an academic talk about detecting design and things like that. You can take a picture of that if you want, anybody. And yeah, so that's just a couple weeks away now. Amazing. All right, yeah, so tonight we're going to talk about sort of evidence for Christianity, but without the Bible, sort of. So, but that would be an interesting thing. I do think sometimes that's overemphasized, like, and we'll talk about that later. There's no reason to say that you can't get evidence about Jesus from the Gospels. Even skeptics like Bart Ehrman say those are our best sources about Jesus. But it's interesting to look at what you can affirm outside of the Bible, or what became part of the Bible later. When they first wrote it, they didn't necessarily know, although I think God inspired them and so forth, but they may not have even known themselves. It's going to be part of the Bible. All right, and so we'll also look at how does Jesus compare with other prominent figures of history, as well as other religious figures in terms of just like biographies and historical reporting about them. So you'll find that kind of interesting to compare. And then as we have time, we'll delve in also to something I find really fascinating that I've been studying a lot of the last few years, is looking at what do modern secular historians that are not Christians say about Jesus and the Jesus movement and how they impacted us culturally. And so there's some pretty amazing concessions that even, you don't even hear this in church usually or something about just how Christianity really had this very positive effect on cultures in terms of human rights, women's rights, things like that. So the first part of my talk will be quite a bit based on this book, which I highly recommend, Can We Trust the Gospels by Dr. Peter Williams. He was set to speak in person to our group, and by COVID canceled it back a couple of years ago, but he does come to the area periodically from the UK. He's at Cambridge University. He has a PhD from Cambridge, and he's the head of the Tyndale House, Cambridge. So he's quite a biblical scholar. He's one of the world's best experts on early languages around the biblical times and before. But he wrote this really accessible book geared towards the popular level, where he summarizes what a lot of scholars are saying about the history about Jesus that you can find outside the Bible, as well as things within the Bible that he thinks, he argues, give you reasons for trusting it. So yeah, we'll jump right in then to the first historian we'll talk about is the Roman historian Tacitus. And he's a really powerful historian to bring in here because he's one of the most respected ancient historians. He gets he has a lot of books that he gets things right. He talks about, for example, Scotland, even though he's never been there. He talks about the lochs of Scotland, these lakes, Nothing about the Loch Ness Monster, by the way. But he talks about it's very cloud covered in that area and all this stuff, even though he'd never been there. And he's also able to report accurately about things in the more distant past. So historians cross-check his work and find, wow, whatever he talks about, he seems to get right. And as a sort of an official historian for Rome, he had access to a lot of records and so forth. And he was a hostile source, so that's also good in a sense. You can't accuse him of being biased, making things up to try to make Christianity look better or something. He actually calls it a disease. He didn't like Christianity. So that also makes it powerful, I think. So the main book where he mentioned, I think the only book where he mentions Christians is the Annals. And it's interesting, the Oxford Companion to Classical Literature says that even in that particular work, it shows Tacitus to be one of the greatest of historians. So what does he say about Christ? Well, first of all, the name he refers to him by is Christus, which should be understood because, well, Christ, who knows what Christ means? What does that really represent? Yeah, and it has to do with the Hebrew concept of what?
The Messiah.
Yeah, the Messiah. So the fact that he's referring to him as Christus, not just like Jesus, is itself somewhat significant and tying it into like, okay, this is at least the claim was that he was the Hebrew Messiah.
Yeah, I was about to bring up the point that it's possible that this wasn't then describing him as Messiah, but as someone who claims to be the Messiah, but you already brought that point.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like I said, he doesn't like Christianity, so he probably doesn't think the Jews have religion right or the Christians. So, so what does he say about him? He says that Christ or Christus was put to death. So that's like the Latinized version of the Greek Christ, of the Hebrew Messiah. So that's why you get these different forms. And actually, Peter Williams, he traces a lot of early references where it went from like an Crestus, an E, to an I, and all this kind of stuff. And in fact, Tacitus at one point says the crowd referred to him as Crestus, but he really was Christus. So there's an interesting sort of evolution of getting the name more correct over time as they're dealing with the language barrier. But it's certain that it was, Jesus Christ that he's referring to here. And he does say that Christ was put to death, crucified under Pontius Pilate, just as the biblical account. And so Pilate was in charge in Judea for that 10-year window of time, 26 to 36. Jesus was crucified, most scholars think, in 30 or 33 AD. I favor the later date, but I'm not 100% sure. And yeah, he says that this disease of this movement of following Christ started there in Judea. And so you can think about how it would be harder, right? If you're going to fake a resurrection, it might have been easier if, if this whole thing started in Rome, that would be a little more suspect, right? Because the people that were the initial followers of this movement wouldn't be able to check up on the empty tomb, and it wouldn't be able to really verify some of the claims of Christianity that are, the resurrection being central. And so he talks about the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. Tacitus is writing later, but he was alive during this time as a kid. But again, he has access to records, historians trust him. And so he talks a lot about the fire. And most scholars, it's not certain that they think the Emperor Nero started the fire. And then it's certain that he blamed the Christians for the fire. And so he documents how Nero persecuted and killed many Christians. But the fact that he's reporting that there is a great multitude of Christians in Rome by 64 AD, so 33 to 64, that's not a huge, 31 years time gap. And then if you think about the distance, it's as far away from, or it's actually farther from Rome to Jerusalem than New York to Havana, Cuba. So it's not trivial to get there, especially in these early times, right? They couldn't just hop on a Southwest airline flight and get over there quickly. They did have boats, of course, but those are also slow, and they couldn't go in the winter sometimes, as you can see in the book of Acts. But yeah, vast multitude that soon is significant. The second source I'd like to discuss is Pliny the Younger. His uncle, by the way, was doing science work related to the Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii, and so he lost his life as a scientist getting too close to that, apparently. But anyway, Pliny the Younger was the governor in modern-day Turkey, where Hayden used to live. And at the time, it was called Asia Minor, and he was governor in this time frame, 98 to 117, so it's a little bit later. But he also reports that there were just vast numbers of Christians. He says not only in the cities, but in the rural areas as well. And he said that so many became Christians that temples for other gods were empty. So that sounds a lot like Acts 19, if you're familiar with that, right? Where they were complaining because people were not buying these idols and they weren't going to these temples of other gods because of this early Christian movement. And he would say, he was kind of writing to the emperor in this one letter where he talks a lot about Christians, and he was saying that, what do I do with them, basically, things like that. And he said, I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed, I repeated the question a second and third time, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they persevered, I ordered them to be led off to execution. So you can see that, that's a pretty big threat that they're under there. And many did recant, by the way, but also many were executed, apparently, in this area. But there's a couple interesting things here that Peter Williams highlights. He says, he would only kill them if they failed to worship the emperor. The implication you see from the writings clearly is that Christians still worship one God. They still have this kind of monotheism carried over from Judaism. And yet they also would worship, they would sing to Christ as to a God, as the next quote shows. So that's an interesting point of connection as well. Don't expect to get a whole lot of details from these non-Christian historians, but you get this very unbiased information, and we'll try to unpack why that's significant later, but I'm just kind of giving you the overview here at this point. And the third historian I'd like to mention is Josephus, a Jewish historian. And he lived a little bit earlier. He lived from 37 to 100 AD. And he happens to have referenced John the Baptist and Jesus. In a couple spots, he references Jesus as well. One of them is potentially interpolated by Christians. It's got a lot of controversy, but most, even secular scholars, affirm that other one as well as being authentic, that at least Jesus claimed to be Christ, is how apparently the original was worded. But we're focused more, actually, for today's discussion on his reporting about the brother of Jesus, James, because he records how he was an early leader of the Jerusalem church, and that's consistent, again, with Acts 15:13 in this case, indicates that. But significantly, this is not recorded in the New Testament, but he says that James died a martyr's death in AD 62. They threw him off the Temple Mount. Apparently, he was, punished by the Jews for his belief in Jesus as Savior and Lord. Okay, so that's kind of significant. Most people think that James, the book in the New Testament called James, was written by James, brother of Jesus. There's some debate about it, but I think that's the most likely scenario. But for sure, he was this powerful leader. And so that's also, I think, interesting. If you start thinking about what skeptics claim about Jesus, that maybe there was some kind of conspiracy, and well, the brother had to be in on it. He would be in a position to know, if a lot of the claims about Jesus were true or not. Actually, one of the interesting things, too, is if you look carefully at the New Testament, it talks about the brothers of Jesus as being somewhat skeptical initially. They weren't really sure. I mean, think about it. Like, if you guys how many of y'all have a brother? What would it take to convince you that your brother was God? Or even just the Jewish Messiah, right? That would be really hard. Or you might be so annoyed, right? The older brother, he's always doing good, and the parents probably were like, why can't you be like your brother? Probably really annoyed, right? So, it looks like, though, that once he saw the resurrected Jesus, he had this powerful conversion that happened fairly quickly, and he was elevated then to sort of a leadership position. All right. So, one of the questions that we sometimes ask is, in thinking about evidence for the resurrection and so forth, or the New Testament authors, is who would be willing to die for what they know is a lie? Many people might die for what they think is true, but how many would be willing to die for what they know is a lie? That's not very many, I don't think. Maybe none. So James would, I think, have kept beliefs about Jesus accurate as well. As an early leader, if people were trying to go, try to say, oh, Jesus said this or whatever, he'd be like, no, I was with them all these years. That's not what he was teaching, and things like that. And actually, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians that multiple brothers of Jesus, he had apparently 4, and multiple sisters, that they were also engaged in ministry. All right, just briefly, I'll mention a couple more. One of them is Suetonius, the Roman historian. He's a little bit later, but he again affirms Nero's punishment of the Christians and blame for the fire. And one interesting thing that he affirms from the book of Acts is the expulsion of Jews from Rome by Claudius. Now that's getting even earlier, because Claudius reigned from 41 to 54 AD, and that's referenced in Acts 18. And because there's Jews later at the time of the fire, it seems that the Jews that were expelled, it was because of this Christus figure once again. And so the ones that were, there was, I think, debates between Jews and Christians. You see that also in the book of Acts. For example, the Thessalonians had some of that going on. Jews from Thessalonica went and tried to argue against the Christians as they went to Berea and different places. So this is also, I think, very significant. It's just affirming something independently and very early. And also, if all the Jews who were Christians were kicked out of Rome, and yet there was a multitude by the time of the Great Fire, then you must have had a lot of additional converts come there in the interim period. So that's interesting. Another philosopher from Syria this time, just to show you there's some geographical distribution as well, Mara bar Serapion, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but he wrote a letter in Aramaic to his son, Serapion, dated by many scholars to shortly after 73 AD. And here he's kind of talking about the execution of the wise king of the Jews, and then how subsequent to that there was the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem, which we know historically at 70 AD the Romans sacked, well, there was a longer period of war, but eventually they defeated the Jews in this rebellion, in Jerusalem in 70 AD that destroyed the temple as predicted by Jesus. And so he's kind of saying, look, people killed Socrates and Pythagoras, and now this third great leader, probably most scholars think it was Jesus as king of the Jews, and that God has punished them. So it's like, so he was a monotheist, but we don't have any reason to think he was a Christian necessarily. But he believed in God, and he was writing to his son, like, don't go against these great figures that God is sending. All right, so let's discuss this. So we have like Tacitus and Pliny confirming that this early movement was worshiping a resurrected Christ, and so this was spread pretty far and wide. You've got Turkey, Syria, Rome, and so forth mentioned just by those historians. And we lack any kind of evidence that belief in Jesus as God was a later development. That can be unpacked a lot more, but so far we do see them, they were singing to Christ as to a God. We see this references to worship. The oldest hymn, the oldest church, the oldest graffiti all show Jesus being worshipped as God. So there's really not good reasons, just if you look at it in an unbiased fashion, for thinking there's some kind of legendary development. And also, as Peter Williams points out, Jews, you didn't have half gods, right? They were very fiercely monotheistic. Greeks, of course, you could have, a god and a human lady get together, and you have like this half god kid, all that kind of craziness. But not in Jews, so there was no ability for Jesus to be, he was either God or he wasn't. It wasn't anything in between. And that was part of why the Jews often rejected. Well, the cross was a stumbling block to the Jews, but many of the Jews ended up rejecting Christ for those kind of reasons. But obviously, most of our New Testament authors were Jews, with the possible or probable exception of Luke. So we can ask, and this is where I want you guys to jump in and share what your thoughts are, but how can Christianity spread so quickly focusing on a crucified Savior? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
I mean, just in general, if it were any other religion, I would say, well, in this case it's Christianity, but the Roman Empire was very huge, and that was during the time when the Roman Empire was kind of at its peak. So information could travel very quickly, and very far. So
compared to previous times, for sure, they had Roman roads and they were making advancements. But compared to modern times, we often forget how slow it would be to advance in terms of like, you basically, a human would walk like 20 miles a day. So it was it was kind of hard for it to spread that quickly. I think it helped that you had like this Passover. A lot of people came, as is recorded in the book of Acts, that were Jews already believing in God, and they came and they heard the message and responded, and then they went back to their home areas. That probably made a big difference. But I mean, what about that though? Are there other religions where? I mean, this is like a common criminal, right? A crucifixion. What do you think, Kevin?
Right, yeah, I mean, a crucified savior who stays dead isn't a very compelling story. So if the fact that it spread so quickly kind of implies that there was, this story of his resurrection was
must have been something to it.
There must have been something incredible about that too, because people don't just rise from the dead. That's not common.
And the Jews from all over that were traveling back to Jerusalem for Passover or feast or whatever, they could check out the empty tomb, as Paul challenged them to do basically in 1 Corinthians, like, hey, we have these 500 witnesses,
you can go
talk to them yourself.
You can go talk to these people who saw him after he rose.
Yeah. Hayden, what are your thoughts? Good to have you visiting us here, by the way, our former president.
To play devil's advocate, the Romans were not popular at this time, and a large part of this was the Roman Empire, and this is someone, even though he didn't directly say, like, challenge Rome, he was clearly not aligning with Roman beliefs, so maybe it spread so popular because he was anti-Rome, like his very character was anti-Rome.
That's a good point that I probably haven't thought through enough. Yeah.
I also wanted to say how like the whole idea of Christianity just being that God comes down and is graceful to you. even after you've done so much wrong, is kind of a message that probably resonates with a lot of people. So
Yeah.
that's also why Christianity is such a, even though it's already big, and yes, there's a lot of missionaries that, go out and stuff, it's like, why are people more focused to come to Christianity compared to other religions? At least that, in my experience, that's what it's been most of the time. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you could make a pretty unbiased case just based on the stats that Christianity has spread more into new cultures than other religions and things like that. Yeah, Alex has his hand up for a while here.
It was disruptive to the intellectual ecosystem at the time. So like any new idea that, so the apostles went around actively spreading, the news of the resurrection and all, and, the Savior and all that. And that turned heads in the intellectual communities. And then people started debating it. And when people start debating something, when people start debating something, more people wants to join in the debate. Basically, it was controversial, and that allowed a lot of people to hear about it.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. They did like to, for example, in the Greek culture, as you guys know, they like to sit around and philosophize, and you see Paul doing that in Athens and so forth. Seth?
I will say, kind of going off of what Hayden was saying, now this probably would have been different as it spread farther out of Judea, but I feel like while it was still in Judea, Jesus's teachings, yes, I mean, they kind of made people go anti-Rome just because of the not worshiping the emperor stuff and a focus, away from Rome, focus on the spiritual kingdom. But I think too, a lot of the Jews there in the day, and I feel like we see in the Bible a lot, that I don't think his message was anti-Rome enough for people
Actually,
to
yeah,
get
for
on
some
that
of them, for
anti-Rome
sure.
bandwagon. I mean, it seems like a lot of them were
They wanted
very
the overthrow.
disappointed that
They wanted the Messiah that was going to conquer
exactly.
Rome, right?
Yeah, I think just that was controversial. I
Yeah.
mean, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I don't think that's what they were expecting
Yeah.
him to be like.
That's an excellent point.
Romans
That's a
13
good response.
exists.
Yeah, one more and then we'll go on.
There's also another factor. There was C.S. Lewis once said of Hinduism that it seemed like two religions to him. One, that the populace were worshiping these individual gods, and the upper classes of the religion were philosophizing. While and this seemed very similar to the situation in places like ancient Greece and Rome at the time. While in Christianity, you could have both
Good insight.
both people worshiping like God as
The intellectual and
in both an intellectual and a personal
the
capacity.
slave or whatever. There were a lot of slaves in the early church.
Not only that, but like Alex was saying, like all the main religions at the time, like the mystery cults, had the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries. They were like really like esoteric, and they had like
Secret
elaborate.
knowledge,
yeah,
right?
they had all this secret coveted knowledge, and it was a members only club, right? And you couldn't always get in, but Christianity was accessible to a wide range of people, like people who were more intellectually minded, like the upper class, and also just more popular level as well. For people who had become dissatisfied with the more popular religion, like with pagan mythology, had an alternative that spoke to them. So it was both a grassroots movement, but it was also deeply profound and inaccessible.
Good point, Ashton. Yeah. All right. Yeah, those are excellent points of discussion. The other interesting thing that Peter Williams tries to challenge us with, based on this historical evidence, is like, well, how did it get this rapid distance? Or he points out that given that there was a rapid distance spread, then that limits how you can change the message. So as it goes to Rome, if the Romans change it, then the people in Asia Minor are going to say, hey, this is different. And it's not to say there were no differences at all, but largely there was this huge movement unified around sort of Orthodox Christianity. You had the Gnostics and some heresies and so forth coming into play. But you did have the basic claims about Jesus and so forth. There seemed to be a lot of unity around that kind of thing. And he points out that, if they did change it, there would have been a lot of evidence. For example, in particular, I think he's trying to argue like the belief that Jesus was God couldn't have arisen, in this kind of scenario when it just spread so fast. If it arose in one area, the other areas would have rejected it. It would have been a huge deal that you would have seen. So that's pretty significant.
Wait, if it spread so fast, why did it say communication was slow?
Well, I mean, that's the amazing thing, I think, right, is that in modern times, I want to help us understand, it's easy for things to spread. I mean, you've got the internet and all these things, and travel is so fast. But in this time, it was challenging. I think all of this points to there needed to be something true behind it. If you start off with the crucified Messiah and you're going against core tenets of Judaism, and they're persecuting you, and Rome is persecuting you, you don't really have an incentive to make this up or lie, and you don't want to believe it unless it's true, I think. And only if it's true and God is behind it, I think, could it spread that fast. Or at least that's the way I see it. I may be biased as a Christian, but Rick, what are your thoughts?
Well, J. Warner Wallace talks about this in Person of Interest, and he talks about how in the centuries before Christ, there was a system of roads that was quite elaborate that the Romans had built. So travel was easier than it had been before.
Way easier than it had been, yeah.
You also had Pax Romana, which was the peace of the region. So there was, you could travel from region to region without being attacked as readily. You also had a common language, Greek, and a common written language, alphabet, that had been standardized for trade. So there was there were a lot of things that made this time a good time for spreading a message. And 20 miles a day, somebody on a mission can go 100 miles, in a couple days, and you can see over a period of months or years, it would not be a problem to believe that this spread.
I mean, obviously it happened, and that was not to say that it couldn't, but more just that there was something significant. But yeah, the New Testament does say that it's like God sent Christ at the fullness of the times, and that's what I see it as, is like all these things preparing it, that it became the ideal time to send the Messiah at that point, once you had all that in place in terms of roads, communication, peace.
But didn't people from every religion get persecuted too? They believed it was true and were willing to die for their belief, but it doesn't mean it was true.
Yeah, we could unpack that more, but do you have a particular religion in mind, or? Because I think most of them don't necessarily. There are some cases, but if you think, for example, about Islam, there was a lot of fighting, but a lot of them was they were more the initiators, I think. Hayden, what are your thoughts?
Plenty of religions almost all religions have martyrs to be religions. Very few have eyewitness martyrs. So the difference between Christianity, so lots of people die for their beliefs. The early disciples would know for sure whether or not it was true, because they would have seen it themselves.
Yeah, what makes Christianity unique is that the truth of the Christian religion is rooted in actual events in history, not just the word of some prophet or another.
So to finish, Muhammad is the only one who saw the angel. So anyone else would die on believing his word. No one really in Hinduism or such that I know of claims to have been eyewitnesses and then persecuted their whole life and martyred for their beliefs without getting any gain from it. So that makes the Christian early church leaders very unique.
Well, there's Joseph Smith, who was martyred
But he was.
because he led a riot against the newspaper for publishing a column against him that was critical of him, and then he was shot in a jail cell while shooting back at the mob that had come for him. So, but it just a little bit different. It's not the same as getting crucified the same way Jesus was. And so so the reason martyrdom in Christianity is different is because the disciples had literally nothing to gain except for severe persecution and oppression. And it's what is there to gain from lying? Essentially, you're basically giving up your life, giving up everything, paying the ultimate price. So it better be worth it.
Yeah, and Joseph Smith got money and followers and wives.
Yeah, he had a huge harem.
Is Joseph?
Alex, right? Do you have something to
Yeah,
add?
I believe the Quran also teaches to kill anyone that deconverts from the religion. So you die because if you deconvert, you're killed anyway. So
I think it's just for any religion that isn't Islam. You don't necessarily have to deconvert.
yeah, but that one specifically.
I think they are more
Especially strict
forgiving,
on
like if you were
apostasy
already a
laws,
Christian
no.
or Jew, they don't tend to do that, but if you, even
Apostasy
today in some countries, that occasionally
It really
happens.
depends on the empire.
Some Muslims might push back a little bit on
It's-
that,
it's-
but definitely some believe that.
Like,
Yeah.
for instance, in Pakistan, you could get the death penalty for apostasy. So you just say something against
Yeah.
Muhammad or the Quran,
True?
you
Yeah.
scribble in it, you get the death penalty for that, so.
Yeah, if you draw a picture of the prophet, that's huge.
Yeah, rabbits have broken out over that.
But usually if you're just like quietly believing in Christianity, they'll leave you alone generally, but
make you
not
pay
always.
jizya.
Well, it depends, like, back then, it depended on the empire. I don't know the specific name of each empire, but I know there was one that was kind of like that, but they would add extra tax on you if you were Christian or any other religion.
The
Actually, that is a
Abyssinian,
normal thing, yeah, in Islam, of like,
Yeah.
okay, we're gonna
That's
tax the
what
non-
Muhammad put in, jizya.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but then there's other ones that were.
The Quran says to fight the Christians and the Jews until they pay jizya or until they convert.
Yeah.
So that's in the Quran, it's from the very beginning.
Exactly. You guys are pretty knowledgeable, good stuff, good discussion here. Okay, we'll move on from this, other than just a quick last comment, like within the New Testament, if you open that door, you get some really early records. There's a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that non-Christian scholars would admit is probably within 3 years of the crucifixion. And it's affirming that Christians believe these certain core things, like that Jesus was raised from the dead. So, and then here's a interesting summary graphic I found online that also includes some Jewish historians. We don't actually have the original writings of Thallus, but we have it being quoted later. And we do get, he attested to the darkness during the crucifixion, apparently. So anyway, yeah, this is an interesting slide that summarizes some things. Since I'm focused more on non-Christians, I didn't mention the early church fathers that we have, but you have some first century writers who are quoting from the New Testament and helping to affirm, for example, that John really, that he really was the author of the gospel and so forth. John the Apostle, that is. So yeah, I can make these slides available if anybody wants a copy later. All right, so we can turn our attention then to comparing biographies about Jesus to other ancient leaders. So Alexander the Great is an interesting one. He's a little bit earlier. He lived from 356 to 323, died pretty young, as you know, after conquering much of the known world. The earliest, what you could really call, I think, a biography was written in the 1st century AD. And of that, the surviving manuscript that we have dates to the 9th century. So that's kind of interesting that, historians trust this work, even though, 9th century, going back to 323 BC, that's over a millennium. It's a pretty big gap. Alex?
I generally get the impression that old historical books like this history of Alexander the Great, or something like the Gallic Wars or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not the Gallic Wars because that was written by Caesar himself.
Okay,
But
good
like,
point. But a lot of the other works
But
don't have
a lot of other things, like stuff by Tacitus or Suetonius,
Yeah.
would be about as credible as like if you were to go to Barnes and Noble and buy some history book from the store.
Okay.
I think you could assign a similar level of.
You're saying they're trustworthy, or what is your main point?
I'm not sure. Like, the point is, they went around. These are secondary sources. None of these are few of these are primary sources.
Okay, right. Yeah, a lot of what Tacitus or Suetonius wrote about was definitely secondary, but they were doing a good job, I think, of summarizing Roman records, and
Yeah.
Tacitus has been cross-checked. It seems to be pretty reliable. Now, we do have a mention of Alexander the Great a bit earlier, 1st century BC, but this is a very broad work. It's not quite a biography, but even then, if you call that a biography, it's still 3 centuries removed. If you start getting into like Hannibal, it's even worse. Hannibal, you might remember, is the guy that attacked with the elephants across the Alps. But we have not really had any contemporary sources from him, which is kind of interesting. And yet historians feel like we can have with confidence various pieces of information about his life. So I don't want to belabor that too much, but we have quite a good set, I think, of documents about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And shown here is the number of words, the century of the earliest copy, and when they were written. This is a slide straight from Dr. Peter Williams. He used the dates here are what the real skeptical scholars would say. There's really a good case to be made that these are all probably earlier than these dates. Although John might very well be in around 90 AD, but these are pretty late. But even if they were this late, they're still doing better than biographies about the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus, Tiberius, who he reigned from 14 to 37 AD, so that was right in the core part of Jesus's adult life and slightly beyond. Now, it's interesting then to kind of compare the number of words, the earliest copy, when they were written, and you see that actually it's pretty remarkable that Jesus, as this figure that was living in the backwater part of the this conquered Roman Empire area of Palestine. Remember they said, nothing good can come from Nazareth. Jesus was from this area of the country that was even looked down upon within the Jewish community around there. So you might say, wait a minute, Tacitus has a lot more words than the Gospels. But actually, this is referring to his Annals, which was about the entire, he covered everything in there that was during Tiberius Caesar's reign. It wasn't just a biography. So the subset that's biographical makes that overall less than we have about Jesus. And as you can see, there's pretty big gaps here in terms of when we have the earliest copy. So we actually have pretty good reasons for thinking we know what they originally wrote, and that we have good source material about the life of Jesus.
Is this earliest completed copy, or is it just a very small piece?
That would be earliest copy, but I mean, because this is going by century, it's almost the same. Like by the time you get to the 300s, which would be the 4th century, you have the Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You have the whole New Testament put together. But yeah, we have like John to like 120 or 130 AD for at least a fragment, and then more of it later in the century. What else, Alex?
I'm thinking that one of the reasons that early copies, the very early copies of the scriptures, of the New Testament scriptures, are still exist today, or at least exist within written record, or at least have been captured within written records today, is because church institutions which date back to that time made it a very high priority to guard the old manuscripts.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, whereas
they believed they were the Word of God, and so they were going to try to protect it.
Whereas of course things that weren't that were of lesser priority to preserve and.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. My main point is just that sometimes people try to create skepticism, like how do you know what was originally written in the Bible and all this, but if you compare it to other works, it stands head and shoulders above them in terms of the number of copies, the earliest copies, all these kinds of features that you would want to be able to trust that you know it was originally written. That could be a whole separate talk in and of itself, but wanted to kind of throw that in there. Kind of talk through most of this. One interesting thing that I didn't highlight yet on here, but you might have noticed, Velleius Paterculus he did write his during Tiberius Caesar's reign. And so you might think, well, that's kind of better maybe than these others wrote like a generation after Jesus. Maybe they lived with Jesus, but they only wrote about it after he died and so forth, which you would want that to be the case if you want them to record the resurrection. But anyway, yeah, the main thing I wanted to highlight here was just that, interestingly, those scholars, they treat Paterculus's writings as least reliable because he was sort of under the thumb of Tiberius. He was hired by him, and Tiberius, by all the other biographies, was said to be this ruthless killer of all his enemies. I mean, even worse than these modern politicians who would have to go and kill him. And they even killed some of his friends. And so, yeah, they think, well, we're not sure we can really, because he only said positive things about this, this ruler that everyone else said was terrible. So it looks like he probably couldn't have written anything negative or for fear of his life.
You wouldn't exactly trust the Pravda newspaper's coverage of what Stalin was doing.
Yes. Go ahead, Ashton.
So I really love Tacitus' Annals and Josephus's Wars, because there's like a ton of explosive evidence in there. And well, I just wanted to mention one thing. So in Tacitus' Annals, he records a peculiar incident which happened in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed as Jesus prophesied.
Okay.
He said that there were prodigies, and prodigies are like omens in Roman mythology. It's like when the gods intervene in human history and like weird stuff happens. And so the prodigies he lists, he says that the temple doors, before it was destroyed, they flung open, and that there's voices on the inside saying, let's depart immediately, and a wind rushing out. And then he interpreted that as the gods leaving the temple, because he doesn't realize that Judaism is monotheistic. And then what else? He said that then there was a battle in the sky. There's like armies fighting in the sky, and that they illuminated the temple and everything like that before it was destroyed. And the most fascinating thing is he closes that section by saying that all this happened while the Jews were expecting a Messiah. And he thinks the Messiah of the Jews is actually Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian, because he's the one who destroyed the temple. He sent his son, Titus, to go destroy the temple.
Yeah.
And so he says that, well, yeah, Vespasian is the Messiah that the Jews were looking for.
Except that he wasn't a Jew.
He wasn't. Someone needs to tell him that. Minor point.
But
But Josephus also says the same thing, and also affirms that Vespasian is the Messiah of the Jews as well.
of course, Josephus
Josephus is a
was
Jew.
Working a deal with them to stay alive, so to speak. So
Yeah.
I didn't know some of those details about Tacitus' writing. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I think that's pretty explosive evidence. Maybe not for, the life of Jesus, but it does
Right.
testify to his
Again,
prophecy.
he's a hostile witness, so he has no reason to really kind of make that kind of thing up and so forth. So
Yeah.
interesting, cool. All right, just briefly, Jesus versus other religious founders. So, like, if you look at the life of Buddha, only in the 2nd century AD, or about 500 years after his life, you get the first biography written about him. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632, but the earliest inscription that mentions him is not until almost 60 years later, and the first biography is not for about a couple hundred years later. So a bit of a more significant delay there. Again, that doesn't falsify that religion, or we're not proving Christianity, but I think it is significant just to see that, as Kevin eloquently mentioned, it is a religion based on historical claims, and so you want to get good evidence historically to evaluate that against. Go ahead, Seth.
The first biography there, was that,
So yeah, we're not counting the Quran. He had this
Okay,
vision.
I was about to say,
It's not, that wasn't exactly a biography.
okay.
In fact, interestingly, Jesus is mentioned more in the Quran
Yeah.
than Muhammad. Which is kind
So I
of
guess
bizarre, but
that's, by Muslim source, I guess that might be like one of the hadiths or something like that. Like something like
Yeah.
that.
So that's like okay, so those are the hadiths. Is what
I think so. Yeah.
Sahih
This
al-Bukhari.
Scholar.
Yeah, maybe
what
some
about
people copy.
and what is the earliest manuscript of like the Quran?
Yeah.
That's a good
That's gonna be my next
question.
There's the Sana palimpsest, which is the earliest I think that's been dated, but it's not even the Quran we have today. It's like a variant of the Quran that was kept in this really old mosque going all the way back to the 7th century.
Yeah, the story they like to
and
tell is that it was received, this is
Yeah, right.
eternal words from heaven, it's never been changed. But you can't find any copy of the Quran before 1920 that matches the modern Qurans. And they've even gone around to different countries and just compared them, and they're like, these are different, even though they're all in Arabic.
Wasn't there a period of time in there where they tried to find and burn all the copies of the Quran?
There was an early
was
thing,
Uthman.
where they tried to let's make sure we have one Quran, and they did burn some.
That was the third caliph, and that happened in the decades following Muhammad's death. Because they wanted to standardize the Quran, and then the Sana palimpsest managed to escape that censor. Well, actually, no. What it was is there was new text written over the top of it, but they could see that there was old text underneath it that was erased, and they were able to
We got
read
some
it
pretty good
based on
technology for
UV
pulling off that
light
these
or whatever.
days.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the first reference to Muslims was also about 60 years later. So yeah, the Gospels really are our best sources, and even Bart Ehrman, as I mentioned, affirms that. And if you look at early heretics like Marcion and Valentinius, or however you say his name, they also said those were the 4 authentic sources about Jesus, and they would have denied that if they could get away with it, because they didn't like all of it. But yeah, you sometimes hear about these other Gospels. If you watch the Da Vinci Code or read the book, you get some nonsense about there being 80 Gospels, so-called, and all this, and no scholar really thinks there's that many. You can go to the most skeptical person out there that's really studied it, they can't give you a list of 80. But there are a list of a number of ones that came at least 50 or 100 years later, or often centuries later even. But you don't find many references to those from anywhere else historically. Part of it is what Ashton was alluding to. A lot of these were more like Gnostic oriented, and that was all secret knowledge. They would never be like, oh, this is the gospel you would add to these other ones. They were like, no, these were the real sayings, and only we know it, and don't trust anything else. But they were written late enough that we know they were forgeries. They claim to be like the Gospel of Thomas or Judas. So they also don't interact with, geography and history like the canonical 4 Gospels do. So just briefly, the Gospel of Thomas is an interesting one. That's sometimes the favorite one, but it was not, you can't find any reference to it until about 220 AD. And it seems to copy some verses from what we think is our Bible. But there was a translation from Greek to Syriac of the book of Matthew. And then they apparently had, we think that Thomas was maybe written in that area. And so they had access to that version that had a mistake in it. And so they propagate the mistake. And so it kind of revealed that this had to be later than the Gospels from which it was based. So there's a whole kind of an interesting backstory there. They caught some scholars off guard that were trying to claim, oh, maybe it's in the 1st century. They really had to back away from that. But it's more of just a sayings gospel, unorganized sayings, and it has some that were based on different books of the New Testament, but they added in Gnostic sayings and so forth. Yeah, Jeremiah.
Which is the gospel which they talk about Mary Magdalene, like what the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, are you talking about, well, even after the Da Vinci Code, Karen King of Harvard claimed to have found something where maybe Mary Magdalene was the wife of Jesus. But she later had to renege that. She's like, okay, yeah, this was a forgery, I was fooled. Even though a lot of other scholars were already saying that long before, like, no, we can't really trust this. And even there, like what she found, it really never said that they were married. They were reading a lot into what was there, but it turned out to be sort of a forgery. So
the Da Vinci Code was like purely fiction.
Yeah, I mean, of course, he, even the preface, he said, oh, it's just a novel and all that, but he would go on these talk shows and say, I tried to be as accurate as possible and all this, and yeah, even people like Barterman, who's very anti-Christian, but he's a good scholar, he would sort of say, yeah, there's a bunch of garbage in that book and so forth. So, yeah, there's some weird things in this Gospel of Thomas. Women were unworthy. They had to become men to be saved. All sex is wrong, even within marriage. So it's just weird that some people were trying to say.
Never happened to go for it.
Yeah, right? It's kind of weird. Also, an interesting one to talk about is the Gospel of Judas. The last one I'll just kind of mention briefly here, but this was definitely a forgery. It was cited by Irenaeus, the church father in the 2nd century, knew of its existence and said, yeah, don't believe this, it's just a forgery. Judas was the hero here in this book. Humans are divine. Salvation by special knowledge. That's Gnosticism for you. But we only ever found one copy, and it was in this Coptic, which is sort of this native Egyptian kind of thing that evolved, after the hieroglyphics. There's still a Christian Coptic church, by the way, which is pretty awesome. Some good folks in that. But yeah, when they mention names in this gospel, it's really interesting because we now have, because of these bone boxes, the Jewish burial practices, we have all these ancient names, and they built up this huge database. And so they compare it against the New Testament, and it comes out matching it quite well as far as name frequency. But the names mentioned in Judas, they're just like, they're not anywhere. There's no way there was 1st century Palestinian Jews with those particular names. So yeah, these things are pretty bogus. I mean, you can go read it yourself if you want to. These are generally short and free online, and you can see they're nothing like the Gospels that we as Christians take as being inspired and so forth.
Yeah, Gospel of Peter, where the cross comes out of the tomb and starts speaking. And then Jesus comes out and he's like a massive giant. He's like 60 stories tall. And then he just like stomps the Roman soldiers with his feet.
Now that is what you call legendary. That shows what happens when you have legendary pictures.
Although, to clarify, Ezekiel and Revelation, that is nothing compared to those books. So just weird stuff happens in the Bible. I'm not saying Gospel of Peter is correct. Yeah. But just because something's weird doesn't mean it's not.
At least there, though, right? He's having visions of, end times, whereas that gospel seems to be saying, like, if you were there looking, you would have seen this giant Jesus come out. So yeah, the last segment, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just kind of touch on a couple things to whet your appetites. But I'm going to show you a brief clip from an interaction. Where they were asking, these are actually, both of these guys you'll hear talking are non-Christians here, but I'll play it and then we'll unpack it a little bit more. I don't have the sound exported. No. That might take more time than it's worth.
Anyone a lip reader?
Let's see how accurate closed captions are.
Squeak it with more space.
Jesus. Put on subtitles.
He's asking him to name one thing that Christianity's introduced that doesn't have a parallel.
One novelty, one innovation in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this often enough, and I cannot think of it.
He's a philosopher, so he doesn't know a lot of history, but he's asking a historian that's also a non-Christian. Matrimony.
Come on.
Not Spider-Man.
He's a lot older than I remember.
It's a different Spider-Verse.
Secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science, as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something Christians share with Jews, but that is it gives a degree of dignity to human beings fundamental to the way that Christians have understood their faith, that it is for all of humanity. And to this day, the heirs of that cultural tradition want to believe that their values are not contingent, but somehow are property of all humanity.
All right, sorry we didn't have better sound. I hope you were able to catch most of that, but he gave him more than one, right?
Like a fish
Gave him
saying,
quite an interesting list.
there's no water. Fish saying there's no, it's like a fish saying there's no water.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. He wrote a book called Dominion. I think that this historian named Tom Holland, quite a really sharp, prolific writer and historian, maybe on the road to Christianity, but at this point he's just kind of come to realize that he used to love all the classics and favor those, and he realized how evil they were, and how, you know, he has these values as a secular humanist that he really inherited from the influence of Jesus and his followers. And he's gained a lot of respect through years of study to that effect. So he's got an interesting backstory, and he wouldn't be the first. I know Rodney Stark also wrote a lot of books about the influence of Christianity and Christ, and he became a Christian eventually just because of seeing all the positive things that came out of it. So Jack, in closing here, we'll just go for maybe 5 more minutes and try to let up just a little before 8:30 here. But so, you know, the New Testament, Jesus is very powerful on the topic of sort of love and charity. Love your enemies. On the cross, he said, you know, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Paul writes, if I do not have love, I am nothing. Jesus says this, if you did it unto one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. A lot of emphasis on just helping others. You have the Good Samaritan parable, which he told to these religious people. You know, the bad guys in the stories were the priest and so forth, and the Samaritan, this other ethnicity, this half-breed Jew, was the hero because he helped rescue the person that was robbed and injured and so forth. So the hero was the Samaritan that the Jews hated. So lots of incredible stuff from Jesus for helping others, being selfless, showing love and charity. And you have a lot of secular authors. William Lecky, not a friend of Christianity, writes about how there really was nothing preceding this. Romans practiced largesse, but it was really more this quid pro quo. You know, you help your friends, you help each other, but in Christianity, you help everybody, and that was scarcely known in antiquity. Pagan satirist Lucian mocked Christian charity. The earnestness is incredible. They spared themselves nothing for the sins. Their first lawgiver put in their heads that they were all brethren. A later emperor who wanted to lead the Roman Empire back to paganism, he was very frustrated. The impious Galileans relieved both their own poor and ours. It is shameful that ours should be so destitute of our assistance. Now, you may not realize, but a lot of early Christians, it was harder for them to be charitable than it is for us today. We get from our excess. But they would fast from meals in order to be able to help feed the poor. Many of them took in, there was a common practice in the Roman culture at the time. They wanted baby boys, sort of like modern China. They wanted the baby boys over baby girls. They would leave the girls out to die often. And so the Christians would find them and take them in and raise them and keep them alive. So a lot of great things there. Obviously, Christians fall short then and today, but sometimes we hear so many negatives about Christianity, right, in our culture, that it's helpful, I think, to realize that Jesus had this radical message that often in our culture, even those who reject Christ take for granted. The Bible really was alone in promoting universal rights and equality. This passage in Galatians is really radical for the time. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free man, male nor female, you are all one in Christ. There was a huge difference in culture between men, women, and obviously between slave and free, and that you even had slaves. Jesus came to proclaim release to the captives, set free those who are oppressed. You have Paul appealing to release a slave, whereas in Islam, Muhammad bought, sold, captured, killed slaves. So a bit of a contrast. And even, you might think, and obviously I think Socrates and Plato were brilliant, and they did add a lot to human knowledge that's just amazing. But they had a blind spot on slavery. They really justified slavery, and they thought, well, maybe some people, and you see this in sort of Darwinism as well, like, oh, some people are just inferior and they're going to be these slaves, and that's just so unbiblical. So you do have Christians, even though Christians, we have to admit, in America, we're often, deceived and bad about the slavery issue. If you do look at those who fought against it, you do find disproportionately almost all of them were Christians. So at least we have that going for us. But anyway, yeah, we could do a whole talk on this kind of topic. Let's see. Yeah, you can look at philosophers from France and Germany that are just like, completely non-Christian, and they'll say things like this, that the equal dignity of all human beings makes its first appearance, and Christianity has become the precursor of modern democracy, that this Christian idea that people were equal in dignity turned an entire world order upside down. In Australia, this prominent thinker, he says virtually all the secular ideas that non-believers value have Christian origins. It was theologians and religiously minded philosophers who developed the concepts of individual and human rights. Same with progress, reason, and equality before the law. It is a fantasy to suggest these values emerged out of thin air once people started questioning God. So anyway, let's close it there and just open it up. If you guys have any closing thoughts or questions about anything that we talked about. Caitlin.
You said the story of Hannibal and the elephants. That came about how long after?
The main point I was making there was the lack of contemporary references. Like during his lifetime, they really didn't find anything. So obviously, eventually, there were some historians recording some of those details. But it's an interesting counter to those who would want to claim, like, why don't we have more writings about Jesus from while he was alive? When in reality, if you look at the number of existing books we have from the first century from that area, there's not much that survived, and there wasn't nearly as much written back then as you would have today, especially from the Palestine area. So you'd have like Josephus and the New Testament. The New Testament is a surprising percentage of all that was written in the first century in that region.
So with the amount of time that happened between like what happened with Hannibal and when we have writings on it, would it be fair to claim that that could have some sort of legendary development that's blown off even though the writings of the Bible are still...
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to those who want to try to take everything in the Bible as being a legendary development, it's a double standard, right? Because they don't do that with other things like that. Now you can argue, and that it's worth discussing in detail in probably a whole separate talk, like, oh, wait a minute, they talk about miracles in the New Testament, though, and we know because of science those don't happen. So yeah, there's more to have that discussion. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to bring elephants over the Alps and so forth as well. So yeah, I think once we give in this group a lot of arguments for the existence of God, and even last week Seth gave the great argument for the origin of the universe is pointing to the need for a God. It looks like the greatest miracle right there. And you study science, you see pointers to it. It's not maybe, it's not proof, but it's a pretty good argument for God. Once you have that possibility of God, a creator God, or a fine-tuner God to set up the laws of physics, everything else is at least possible. He seems to be able to have control over the laws of nature. And skeptics themselves ask for miracle claims, right? Oh, I believe in God if I saw a miracle. And so when you have these gospel writers reporting it, you can't just dismiss that and say, well, because they report it, they must have been lying. It's sort of circular reasoning. All right,
maybe
one
the
last
miracle is that the
question or
church
thought.
has survived
Even
for this
Dawkins,
long.
who is like the kind of main guy behind modern atheism, he said if God personally spoke to him, he would just think he was hallucinating. So even if he saw a miracle, it would not be enough.
Yeah,
Talking
that's
about
a good
Richard
point.
Dawkins.
Sometimes nothing is enough for some folks. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. So tonight the plan is to go to Brahms, right?
Yes, yeah. I was gonna mention that. Probably, what time is it now? 8:20.
8:22.
Okay, yeah, so probably like another maybe 15 minutes from now we'll head out to Brahms.
And next week
And
we're
if you
at
need a ride, you
SSA.
can ask any of the
Yeah,
leaders.
yeah, if anyone needs a ride, just
Yeah.
ask around and hopefully we'll be able to get you somewhere.
And thanks for coming. Come back and invite some friends.
What are those, the infinity duckies?
Jeremiah, thanks for coming out.
For like 40 minutes.
Oh, yeah, we have a lot of variety in our talk.
Yeah, sorry.
It is, yeah, it's always